entitled this one Charlie Chaplin. I was 15 and had all the lanky awkwardness of my age. It was Christmas season 1952 and bells were ringing. Dave and I were out of school for the Christmas break, and Frances High, the wife of Dad's partner, picked us up at Dad's office, 799 Broadway, to take us to a movie. I had no idea we were going to be a witness to history. Dave, age 11, and I had ridden in on the subway from Jamaica, Queens, where we lived in housing built for functionaries of the United Nations International Headquarters. Very few of our neighbors were American. How we got the apartment was probably another one of Dad's scams, I'll never know. The two of us rode in by ourselves. I watched out for my kid brother. We left the office, walked to the other side of Broadway, across from Union Square to a delicatessen, bustling with lunchtime business. We advanced to the counter as the customers in front of us received their food. Suddenly I was flushed against it with a guy on the other side, impatiently waiting for my order. My voice had nearly changed completely, so I talked in what I perceived to be a low register, manly. Normally I only use this voice talking to girls on the telephone, but it seemed to be appropriate now. I proceeded to order. I'll have a... Just then my voice cracked to a high-pitched tone no tenor could reach. Ham on rye. A pin dropped on the other side of the room, and it was silent enough in there that everyone could hear. All 150 customers glared at me. The guy on the other side of the counter in a white paper restaurant hat and looking like a pissed-off Mel Brooks said, "We're kosher, kid. Order something else." Frances, in a voice of calming rescue, said to the guy, "You'll have a corned beef." "That's more like it," he said, made up the sandwich and slid it across the counter at me. I caught it just in time, so the catastrophe was not complete, or at least not just yet. Dave and Frances got one too. As Frances paid for our sandwiches, I noticed a table becoming available near the wall opposite the counter. I raced over to it and saved seats for the three of us. Another man, also with a white paper hat, came over and cleaned off the table with a rag that obviously had been used many times before. It was saturated with many stains. It looked like a Jackson Pollock painting, but he had a disdainful glare on his face and I couldn't say anything. As I began to eat and recover from this humiliation, I noticed the floor, made with small tiles with a blue pattern that stretched all the way from the counter to the table. It fascinated me because the blue lines seemed to cross. "Oh, now I get it. It's the Star of David." "Wow," I said out loud. The pen dropped again. This time, as if in unison, everybody seemed to shake their head from side to side in disdain. Somewhere in the distant past of social history, someone from Indiana must have done something like this, creating the synonym for bumpkin, Hoosier. We clicked quickly down the sandwiches, and Frances began to look at her watch. In a minute or two, she said, "We've got to go. I don't want you to miss the start of the show." We walked out and caught a cab for Times Square. At 43rd and Broadway, we alighted in front of the United Artists Theater. The New York office of United Artists was in the building too, up on the 8th floor. On the marquee, in alternating flashing lights, were Charlie Chaplin, Limelight, Charlie Chaplin, Limelight. Frances brought 2 tickets, gave them to me, and she said she would meet us after the movie, and we went around the corner, or then she went around the corner to the entrance of the office building. It was a small house, not one of those 1920s movie palaces of the Great White Way. It looked more like a neighborhood theater. Dave and I walked about halfway down and we took our seats. At this point, a couple of contextual explanations are in order. Dad and Ernie High, Mr. 5x5, from an earlier encounter, were partners in a national telephone scam. Essentially, they called all over the country to businesses with complex ruse amounting to this: buy an ad in the AFL Spotlight and stay on the good side of the unions. This time, though, they were, via payoffs, an official organ of a local, very local plumbers union. It seemed the safe thing to do if you ran some small tool and die shop in Peoria, and cheap too. The ads cost $200 or $300. What a deal! You can make 5 or 6 of these calls in 1 hour. And I know from personal experience that you can score over half the time. It was a great racket and probably still exists in one form or another. The next explanation is somewhat more complex, but has to do with our brief witness to history. In 1952, it was the height of the McCarthy era. Everyone who had belonged to any politically progressive organization, or for that matter, anyone who knew anyone who did, was, according to the reactionary press, considered an enemy of America. There was indeed an Un-American Activities Committee in the United States House of Representatives and an equivalent one in the Senate, on which Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin served. It was a monstrous witch hunt and ruined the lives of many people. Charlie Chaplin was one of those targeted. Claire Bloom, Charlie's co-star in the movie, was blacklisted in Hollywood for simply knowing Chaplin. She was only 21. The movie played, as it turns out, for only 1 week, was withdrawn because of political pressure, and it wasn't shown again in the United States for 20 years. Oh, and one other thing while I'm on congressional committees. Ernie High was called before the McClellan Labor Rackets Committee a few years later, refused to testify, took the fifth, and was sentenced to a term in a federal pen in Arkansas. You had to know Ernie. He knew how to con. I'll bet by the time he left there, he was wearing an imported, tailor-made gabardine prison uniform, complete with a monogram. So now back to the movie. First of all, there were no newsreels, cartoons, previews, nothing, just the movie of the sadness of a slapstick clown who was no longer funny. A Pagliacci desperate behind the mask of dull jokes, trying with anguish to hang on to what used to be. It had its moments, particularly the ad-lib fooling around with Buster Keaton. This segment, I believe, is a film classic of 2 masters playing off each other. It is brilliant. But overall, it wasn't what 2 young kids expected. Way too serious. I was anticipating hilarity and got things to think about instead. Actually, I couldn't wait till it was over. Dave and I glanced at each other and gave that look as if to say, what the hell is this? It finally ended, we walked out, and there was Frances. Well, boys, did you like the movie? She asked, in a way obviously expecting a positive answer. Yeah, it was really funny, Dave replied. I nodded. Okay then, We are going to the party upstairs. Mr. Chaplin himself is supposed to come later, and maybe you both can meet him." What? This was fantastic. I had already shook hand, well, not hands, hooves, with Gene Autry's horse back in Baton Rouge, but this was a real guy. We walked around the corner of the building. Chaplin was one of the founders of United Artists, and the party was up on the 8th floor at their New York distribution office. Frances had been the office manager before she took up with Ernie. The elevator door opened. The operator said, "Mrs. High, that party is going great. I just took Ida Lupino up, and Arlene Francis is already there." "You ain't seen nothing yet," said our host. "I was told Chaplin is coming." Could it be? We got to 8. The door opened. We got off, went around the corner, and Frances, swinging her purse wildly, she had had a couple of drinks, swung her purse up and hit this guy right in the balls. He went down like a bowling pin, moaning, holding himself, doubled up with agony. Oh, God, no. It was Martin Gable, Arlene Francis' husband. She bent over him in helpless anguish, then turned to our Francis, saying, "Look what you've done. Damn you, if he's hurt, I'm going to sue." "I am seriously hurt," said Mr. Gable, but actually he wasn't. He sat up, looked at Miss Francis, and said, "I'll be all right. It was just an accident." The elevator man helped him to his feet. He brushed off. They got on the elevator, and that was that. Wow, I sort of met Arlene Francis. I had never heard of her husband, but I sort of met him too. The double doors of the office were wide open, and the large room with private offices off to the side was full of people. There was a din of conversation broken by occasional unison laughter when a small clutch got the gist of a funny story. They were all adults, talking, smoking, eyes rolling, whispering, taking each other by the arm, hugging, a withering mass of people of a world I didn't understand. Right away, I felt my youthfulness. Except for Dave, I was by far the youngest person in the room, with no way to disappear. Here we go. We walked right through the chatter to the windowed wall on the opposite side from the entrance. People kind of made way for us once they saw we were not Chaplin. There was a kind of disappointing acceptance coupled with a disdainful look at Francis, as if to say, "What are you doing bringing kids to a cocktail party?" Dave and I stood by the window, looking out at our limited vista of New York, and occasionally at each other, our only lifeline to non-embarrassment. Our semi-seclusion seemed interminable. It was probably 15 minutes or so, but seemed like an hour. Dave and I looking out the windows, then occasionally back at the party, at each other, and then out the windows again. Then Frances came over, trailing by the hand this short, beautiful woman, trailing a tall man like a chain. Oh, God, it was Ida Lupino. I recognized her from a movie Mom had taken Dave and me to back in Baton Rouge. No babysitter, so we had to go too. It was called To Each His Own. It was mushy and dull from my perspective, but heck, here she was with Francis. Boys, I'd like you to meet Miss Ida Lupino." I gasped. She held out her hand. I shook it. She said, "I'm delighted to meet you." I said, "I saw you in To Each His Own." She said, "Did you like it?" "It was great," I lied. She smiled and said, "This is Howard Duff, my husband." My eyes lit up. This time I stuck out my hand and he shook it. "You're Sam Spade on the radio. I listen every week." This time it was the truth. I was in awe. He later made movies, too, but this was Sam Spade at the Christmas Party Caper. He called all of his programs capers. My knees were shaking. I had touched stardom. I didn't care if Charlie Chaplin was coming or not. He shook hands with my brother, too, but Dave appeared to still be in the nether world of our and out of place misery. They all went back to the adult party, and I joined Dave in our empty world out the window. The party seemed to be quieting down, and still no Charlie. It was getting a little dark outside. By now, the people were beginning to leave. Finally, this guy got up on the desk and announced that Chaplin was not coming. That indeed, he was still in England, and he was not coming back to the United States. There was a collective sigh of disappointment, but a kind of nodding understanding, too. Why should he face the inquisitors when he didn't have to? And he didn't return for 20 years. Limelight was withdrawn after only 1 week and never shown again in this country for decades. The right-wing witch hunt had worked its evil. We left the party shortly after the announcement and went downstairs to the cold dark of 43rd Street, rode silently in a cab back to Dad's office, and then with Dad back to our place in Queens. Of course, I was only peripherally aware of Chaplin's story, but I did tell Dad about meeting Sam Spade. Charlie Chaplin had been an icon of his own youth, and he seemed not to be listening to Dave and me. How could he? Look what they had done